talk about ethical concerns and theory application of surgical robots. And next slide. All right, so similar to a vehicle, there's 5 levels of autonomy for surgical robots. And with level 0 being the lowest level, where there's almost no function to that of level 5, which is fully autonomous. Most that are currently surgical robots that are used is level 2 to 3. And then generally speaking, there's many advantages and disadvantages of using surgical robots. And then there are certain type of procedures that are commonly used, such as the colectomy, appendectomy, gallbladder removal, hernia removal, gastric bypass. I named a few of the most common ones, but the one you're going to hear mostly about is the Da Vinci robot, but that also has a high cost of upwards of $1.5 million and sometimes could be not accessible to some facilities. And then there's generally 3 facets to robotic surgery: controlled, automatic, and semi automatic. Controlled is what it sounds like in terms of almost everything the surgeon's operating on his own. Automatic is where the robot is able to operate without any human uh, interaction. And then semi-automatic is where the guiding of the motion is mostly in control by the robot, and then a physician or surgeon who's trained is monitoring the status. And then technical background. So advantages include ability to allow for teleoperations, and this is technically beneficial in like third world countries or remote or in military, where to save soldiers. And then some advantages also include ability for human errors, accounting for certain areas such as dexterity, lack of human attention, stuff of that nature. And then also, there's times where certain procedures are more accurate through use of robots. And then the other aspect is simulation and historical data trends, stuff that they could use to do a simulation before the actual testing occurs, or not the testing, but the actual procedure. And then disadvantages is it's very, like I mentioned, for the Da Vinci robot. There's also other robots, but mostly Da Vinci is going to be talked about because that's the only FDA approved one. And then also there's a strong chance of mechanical breakdown and software connectivity issues. And uh, to put it very lightly, there's a lot of concerns from both an ethical, legal, uh, morality standpoint, accuracy, from a trust standpoint. If I talk about a lot of those aspects, this presentation is going to go to 2 to 3 hours, but there's only going to be 3 type of questions that I'll be discussing in this presentation. And then and then the 3 different identified ethical concerns based on the findings of lit review. For each of the questions will be discussed and elaborated using surgical robots as listed below. And then the application section will discuss potential solutions and suggestions based on 3 theories: virtue ethics based on Aristotle, deontology Kant, utilitarianism Mill. Please note that for each of the identified sub-ethical concerns, maybe one of them are going to be used, maybe 2 of them, or maybe 3 of those are going to be used, and it's all going to depend on the specific question. I'm going to read off the specific questions. On the future reports, it's going to be Q1, Q2, and Q3. But I'm going to read it off now, and once I get to those specific ones, the slide's going to show it, but I'm not going to read the whole question. So the first one is, what is the current status of training, licensing, credentials, qualifications, experience, and knowledge required of the surgeon to operate surgical robots? And what is a common ethical concern between these findings? There are concerns over biases in the data when utilizing AI in the treatment and diagnosis of patients. What type of biases and inadequacies in the algorithm with respect to treating patients exist? What type of ethical concerns do these biases cause or causes? And then 3 is, how are patients currently being informed about info and data with respect to surgical robots? What type of challenges currently exist regarding surgical info that can be provided to patients? So this is just going to be the 3 theories. I'm going to summarize some aspects of this pertaining to the 3 theories. But virtue ethics is focused on the characteristics of the moral agent performing an action. The moral agents could be humans, mostly humans, but there's going to be, but also throughout the classes, there's aspects talked about such as prudence, which is exercising caution during practical, unprecedented situations. Also, achieving eudaimonia, happiness or good life. There's also using reason as a function of human to do so, and that makes us unique from other moral entities. And then also the idea of throughout our whole life to develop characteristics and achieving perfect moral character. And then deontology is study of duties, obligation, and morality of actions without really considering the consequences or the character performing the action. And a lot of it's also based on universal moral laws. There's certain aspects such as we really don't take into account emotions as well. It's really based on strict duty, obligations, also mostly on the, but we don't really consider consequences of the actions. And then utilitarianism is going to be based on looking at the outcome of an action. And then, generally speaking, an action that has the greatest net effect and has the chance of promoting the most happiness is the most preferable in utilitarianism. And generally speaking, anything that uh, creates less happiness or harm, those are least in favor of utilitarianism. And then there's also quantity versus quality aspects that were discussed between Bentham and John Mill. But in this standpoint, we're going to be talking about it kind of from a higher level standpoint. But there are different forms of utilitarianism as well. So the first question is, I already read that first one, so this is the slide that introduces it. But I'm going to start on it. So this is the first review that I reviewed and read through. And some of the common findings and the things that really stood out to me is, as of the last update in April of 2013, the American Urologic Association stated the responsibility of credentialing surgeons lies with the individual institutions. And then, as a result of this, this leads to inconsistencies in how surgeons are evaluated within the training. However, at the same time, there's only one study that was really promising, and that's going to be the Fundamentals of Robotic Surgery program. And then this was agreed upon between a handful of physicians that were selected within 14 international surgical societies. And then they, through a consensus, were able to identify 25 measurable variables that they felt are going to be used as a strong metric to determine the proficiency and the skill set level of physicians that are in training. And to the right is the photo of uh, specific for Institute of Surgical Excellence that provides this fundamental of robotic training. But this is common in a lot of hospitals and a lot of institutions that works with surgical robots. And then the other aspect of the specific subfields is divided into three specific facets. There's knowledge base, tactile skill, and then non-technical skills. So knowledge base is what it sounds, just the knowledge of just like anatomy, more about surgical robots, the different type of technology that appear. Tactile skill is more on the hands-on approach, such as understanding the movement, how the robots interact with the surgeon, times where there's also virtual simulations, there's dry lab, wet lab, different type of different type of trainings that's available, and that's going to be also discussed. The non-technical is the communication aspect between different type of physicians and other aspects that are not necessarily just for surgeons. And then another important aspect they talked about is, instead of quantity of the specific uh, cases that are done, the best metric would be based on agreed upon metrics, kind of tied to what the fundamental of robotic surgery program addressed. And that's one thing they agreed on in terms of what should be implemented for like a consistent training among all different surgeons. And then the next one is, this is the second lit review that I reviewed. And then this one is basically a study within 11 different studies, so different journals and trainings that occurred from 2014 to 2021. And then some were retrospective reviews and some were randomized trials. And then the residency, sorry, technical issue. Okay. All right. So the residency status of some of these individuals would be different, as some might have a general resident while some are specialized. And then also some of these procedures included colectomy, prostatectomy, hernia, gastric bypass, biliary GS cases, And then the mode of training were different for some of them, for a lot of these tests. So some of these tests will have maybe online session, they might have dry lab, wet lab, but then they might completely not have any virtual simulations. And the other case also applies where sometimes there's going to be just a licensed surgeon that's going to be given individual attention and no other forms such as online training. And as you can imagine, uh, some numbers that backs it up to give a breakdown of exact numbers. 99% of training plans use a robot simulator. 52 use training plans using online courses. 45% of training plan use industry-sponsored training courses, and 17% of training plans use live animals. So this refers to the wet lab, like I just referred to. And then the study concluded that though there's many tools and resources that are available to assist and train residents, there is a lack of coordination that exists between all the different training programs, and then a lack of a similar standard to measure and assess surgical competency. And then while they did admit that is a downfall or a research gap, they did make it very clear, at least this article, that they're not intending to propose of a solution and increase the the further ambiguity that exists within this specific study. So that's something they haven't discussed of a specific plan. And the next slide is, did I skip one? One sec. Nope. All right, we're good. Okay, so this is the third lit review, and then this is just a normal statement that was mentioned on the lit review, and it's surgeons have a moral responsibility to seek and acquire necessary skills to conduct procedures independently. This kind of ties towards like Kant's deontological perspective of certain morals that human beings should have, and this is no different within the surgical field, whether it's through surgical robots or surgeon like manual surgery. And then some cases that show, at least reported by the FDA, between the years 2000 and 2013, there were 144 deaths, and then 1,391 injuries, and 8,061 device malfunctions reported to the FDA. And then most of these deaths were attributed really to the lack of adequate or sufficient robot training. And traits such as autonomy, justice, beneficence, and non-maleficence were both compromised when surgeons operate with robots without the correct training and supervision. And kind of to define beneficence and non-maleficence, these weren't really discussed too in depth, but beneficence is the idea of doing something good, just like, and it kind of ties to the concept of a categorical imperative. And then categorical imperative we talked about in class, where it's an absolute moral obligation for all rational beings. Some examples like donating to the needy, regardless of what the actual circumstance behind people being able to donate. It's something that's a rational moral obligation that could be applied to all rational beings. And then there's also non-maleficence, which is principled in medical ethics that require a medical practitioner to do no harm to a patient. And then this kind of ties to the first Asimov law, where humans have a duty, or no, not humans, but robots have a duty to not harm another human being. So through surgical robots, in theory, if it did harm a human being, that would be violation of the first Asimov law. And then, and then, regardless of the credentialing aspect, each stage of the training of surgeons and surgical robots creates a much higher risk in comparison to that of later stages and will incorporate different quality standards. So what this essentially means is during the earlier stages of the training, there are going to be inherent quality differences in terms of people are going to make, generally speaking, more errors, and then it's normalized in that aspect. So the context in which the errors would occur and the quality within those cases are going to be different from later on, where after a certain amount of cases, those surgeons are going to be expected to have a certain level of competency. So the standard is going to be different in that respect. Some experts believe it takes up to 200 to 700 surgeries to become an expert robot surgeon, with an emphasis on both technical and non-technical skills to become adept. But that number has been tossed around quite a bit. Sometimes it's going to be 100 to 300. And the person who came with this number, generally they have a lot more cases, but this is going to be also contingent upon the person making the analysis. So they have a lot of experience. That's where this 200 to 700 surgeries are applicable. Another challenge is sometimes just getting enough cases or getting exposure to these can be a challenge, as there's not many cases that could be really applied to year. So that's one challenge that, you know, can change the numbering for this. And then there's an importance of robustness and reproducibility of data if the surgical robots are to be implemented clinically. And as you can imagine, sometimes there are concerns behind this in reality. And then an ethical imperative of avoiding previous year mistake must be a priority. And then realistically, this article mentioned about how in the future the author believes that there's going to be a trial period for training and assessment, and this training assessment could take years. But then the reality of this being implemented and ubiquitously, at least at a larger scale within within offices, would be it'll take a lot of years before that happens. But a lot of it's going to be trial and a lot of there's going to be a lot of studies on this before this can be implemented in a much larger scale. Next slide. All right. So another lit review is going to be the legal, regulatory, and ethical frameworks for developing standards in AI. So based on the guidelines that the FDA has recommended, so they have a specific guideline, and they said the FDA recommends for patients and healthcare providers about robotically assisted surgery. So the specific stating they said is that FDA does not regulate the practice of medicine and therefore does not supervise or provide accreditation for physician training, nor does it oversee training and education related to legally marketed medical devices. And explicitly, they also mention instead training developments and implementations the responsibility of the manufacturer, physicians, and healthcare facilities. So what this essentially means is this significance also adds to the engineering hurdles of developing these systems, not only that they must be programmed to execute difficult tasks, but they also must be configurable to adapt to different legal requirements in different jurisdictions. And then, but at the same time, the FDA did propose of in June 2018, they have an FDA software as a medical device pre-certification. And then the main objective of these were to incorporate AI and machine learning software functions within the algorithm to adjust for some of the training and but there hasn't been aside from that there hasn't been too much involved from the FDA, but that's really the only aspect where they have come into play. But they're overall, again, tied towards a legal licensing and credential. Nothing of that sort has really been implemented at this stage. And then another aspect is when attempting to get approval for the mass deployment of surgical robots outside of the US, even though it might serve the functions of the US and meet requirements, or if even hypothetically the FDA did approve of this doesn't necessarily mean that this could be used in other countries or the standards would apply to Germany, Sweden. These are just other robotic surgical robot leaders in the world, but there's also China, Korea, Germany, Sweden, Italy. Uh, but long story short, it doesn't necessarily mean all those standards were going to be applicable. And then there's also data biases that are going to be different demographic data. And then this aspect, so I mentioned also that this concept ties similar to the ethical issues with data biases, but that's going to be evaluated in Q2, so question 2. And then also, okay, I think I mentioned that the realistic future is going to be similar to or I haven't talked about this, but the author mentioned that the realistic future of surgical robots is going to be like a driver monitoring a self-driving vehicle. So the surgeon is going to be like in the driver's seat, and it's going to work directly alongside the surgical robot, and then it's going to engage or intervene in situations where there's going to be danger to a patient or something that's problematic. And then, so that's what the this article specifically mentions as the reality. Next slide. So summary of literature review and ethical issues identified. So all the lit review documents emphasize the importance of knowledge, hands-on practical experience, either from physically or simulated based non-technical skills, team building, and communication in some form. And then all the lit reviews also use similar training modules, like I talked about the dry lab, virtual lab, virtual reality, where there's going to be certain type of simulations that are run, and then they'll be able to interact with the surgeon, and then also through the simulation, it'll give some form of loopback or feedback mechanism where the person or the trainee is going to be able to feel the hand movements, and it kind of ties towards the dexterity aspect, and they'll have a feel for how they should be proceeding with a certain operation. And then main difference is the properties or the proportions of using the different training plans are in different proportions with respect to the other training plans. So it kind of ties to what I talked about for one of those training, where within the 11th studies, remember how there were different proportions. Some might have a dry lab, but then they won't have any online studies, stuff of that nature, where it's going to be different proportions or a full emphasis on maybe online training or from something from the manufacturer, such as Intuitive Surgical, who makes Da Vinci robots. But as you can imagine, that's going to cause a difference in how people are trained from different institutions. And then the other common difference includes the measure of competency of the surgeons between different titles, the evaluator, an evaluator, proctor, or an experienced surgical robot expert. So another area is this create biases in how evaluation can be made. So between different institutions and hospitals. And then another aspect is different laws in different countries make it a challenge to license surgical robots for in other countries and even to serve the purpose of the US. And then but to given there's a lot of complexity involving legal, social, cultural, economic, that's part of the reason why I'm not going to go too in depth because this presentation is going to be really long if I go into depth in that aspect. So the application that I'm going to provide for a framework to address these ethical concerns is going to be scaled kind of to the U.S. just on a local scale. Given the U.S. has the most involvement in this surgical robot field, and also the fact that there's lacking of a formal licensing board, I feel it's good to start at a small scale, kind of at the state level, similar to a PE. And this is what I'm going to discuss. So, professional engineering exam, kind of similar to that, but I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. Application of theories, ethical question one. So, let's get started. So, from an Aristotle virtue ethics standpoint, like a PE license administered through NCCS, so that's the organization that monitors PEs, and then in certain type of fields, this is common in like bridge work, certain type of work where there's a high liability concerns, and essentially the proposition I'm believe based on some of these ethical issues is a separate qualification board or organization completely independent of that of any academic institution or medical college needs to be implemented to allow for training of physicians in higher education and hospitals. This ensures that standards, qualifications, training requirements, and qualification needed to retain the license remains the same across all institution and resident physicians and accounting for differences in training that exist among the higher education institutes. And then also the same institute's going to be responsible to determine the licensing, the registration, not registration, but renewal process as well. So the skills that surgeons will need to retain the license and to continue practicing using surgical robots. Unlike that of a PE license, there are also going to be certain years of experience the surgeon must experience to being able to practice individually through private practice. And then during the beginning phase of the license implementation project, inherently there's going to be a lot less people that are actually going to be qualified or have surgical robot experience. It is also established that people that are in residency they don't even have the adequate training. So one proposition that I proposed is there's it should be focused mostly on experience as well. So a lot of people with 10 years to 15 years of experience would be more preferable in this role compared to someone with residency experience with 1 to 2 years. So this kind of ties to Aristotle's concept of practical wisdom and ethics being wasted on the youth. So the specific quote on the assignment is, at least in the Solomon book, is young people, presumably college students, have not had enough experience in life to know what is good, easily distracted by both desires and emotions. This could be problematic within a surgery or in surgical robots where they're not exactly sure how to deal with a complex situation. Emotions could come into play. There's also uh, other aspects that are not necessarily within the control, also within for that specific surgeon, but through the practical wisdom, uh, simply that college student's not going to have experience to deal with. Even given he's a resident student, he doesn't have practical experience with surgery in general. But the argument I'm making is that someone who has more years of experience with surgery in general, aside from just surgical robots, will be more well equipped to deal with some of the emotional aspects that are inherent within just surgery in general, because there's emotional aspects that need to be in control during the course of surgery, whether it's both manually or through surgical and or through robotics surgery. Next slide. All right. So a weakness or counter argument one can make pertaining to age requirement and older patients in surgery with certain skills required is decreased function or decrease in skill in certain areas such as dexterity, knowledge, teamwork. However, there is a study based on the Wisconsin card sorting task, and this study basically studied the pathways or like the critical thinking pathways that are involved in a complex cognitive function. So what this required is the performance of the older person is the same level as the young counterpart, and they're able to adjust to those complex situational tasks when needed. So in turn, what happened is that they require less brain consumption in those specific situations because they're able to know when exactly to use, when exactly to adjust based on the specific situation. And this kind of ties towards like Aristotle's practical wisdom and phronesis, where people that are more experienced are able to know and being able to adjust to unprecedented situations. And then, as I kind of mentioned in the last slide, to get people to be evaluators, mentors, and training, 5 to 10 years of non academic residency experience can suffice. But as this program continues on, there's going to be more observations, different type of things that are actually proven to work versus things that we believe are going to work. So this program should be based on a 5 year program, and then there should be observations on based on patient feedback, complication, complaints, field of surgery, and other performance metrics. And then eventually the goal is going to be to continue on improving on this licensing for like surgical robots. And then a quote that I found is the part about happiness. So this kind of ties towards Aristotle's principle of eudaimonia through continuous growth. And specific quote that's mentioned on the Solomon book is this part is called happiness. By aiming to continuously improve on the licensing requirement, this ensures the continuous growth of the profession as a whole, which also affects the virtual ethics that the individual physicians have. So each individual physician throughout the course of this improvement is going to have uh, improvement based on this idea. And then okay, so Aristotle's specific quote was Aristotle set up the structure based on all overall theological scheme. Everything we do have as a goal, and all the things we do have a goal. So that was a specific quote. And then this program should be run with the same parameters for a set period, 5 years. And after that time, changes should be implemented. But uh, also, the only time where there should be changes uh, almost immediately would be in situations where there's a great danger of human and public safety or violations of certain Asimov laws. So in that situation, even with these in play, anything that an Asimov law would have or it would violate, at that point, I believe there should be more priority towards the Asimov law if there's any of those parameters are violated. But these should hold true for the starting of a licensing board. And then I'm going to continue on. And then this one's going to be based on multiple theories. Robotic surgeries can occur in facilities or that have insurance that meet a certain threshold in liability. So the exact number is contingent upon multiple factors. From a utilitarianism standpoint, there's a common good for the greatest number of people as it ensures liability is shared between the insurance company, the doctor, the hospital, and a form of accountability is taken in the case a tragedy occurs. From a deontological standpoint, requiring insurance to operate surgical robots ensures that the hospital has a moral duty to pay for injuries or death to family members, which in turn foster a greater level of trust between patients and surgery faculty members. Our requirement of having a medical facility insurance is a morally good duty that universalizes the concept of protecting the health and well-being of another human being. This supports the first law of Asimov, not harming another human being. And then another aspect is given the fact that medical facilities in general have certain immunities under laws through providing medical care, it is possible that a false promise of being able to pay or that patients have certain type of rights or being able to get compensation in the event of a wrongful death. So by ensuring that the facilities are capable of paying and will pay and have the means to pay through insurance liability, it causes it basically creates a system where there's more trust between the patients and the medical facilities that offer this care. And then actually, this ties towards both utilitarianism, deontological standpoints, morality of the surgeons can be compromised for money. If there's no laws that had this type in place, there would be more. This would destroy the morality of the specific doctors or the people that are involved in surgery, and they might have other morality issues or things that would affect their judgment. So that's where having a form of insurance is imperative to ensure and be prepared for situations where there's complications in this newly emerging field. And the second question that's going to be discussed is there concerns over biases in the data when utilizing AI in the treatment and diagnosis of patients? What type of biases and inadequacies in the algorithm with respect to treating patients exist, and what type of ethical concern do the biases cause or causes? So one aspect is the SAIS, surgical AI system, which shows an underskilling and overskilling bias at different rates across surgeon subboards. So the way this specific uh, experiment worked is that there were three different type of hospitals. There were certain type of procedures, and for certain type of skills, it was able to accurately determine the specific for needle driving and needle handling of a specific surgical activity, and it was able to. The performance was very reliable, but the issue is for some of the procedures, they either overestimated the specific capabilities of that specific procedure, and for some of them, they either underskilled, and if it was actually better than it's supposed to be, they would actually rate it lower. So this ended up creating some biases within the software. And then there's also impacts of algorithms assigning false negatives, and it could create certain consequences such as less follow-up scans and more undiagnosed cancer cases for demographic. And then algorithm trained on hospital data for US patients might not have similar results in benchmark standards for someone in Germany. And some of that could be due to different medicine being available, different strategies, and different medication system plans being different as well. But there are some things, such as the FDA released a plan emphasizing the importance of mitigating some of these biases, and then the starting of the Standing Together initiative. And this basically accounts for data diversity, inclusivity, and generalizability. This was launched in September 2022 to address recommendations for some of these AI biases. Next slide. All right. So this is the other review in relation to this question. And then AI systems used in surgery have algorithmic and statistical biases which tend to affect underrepresented groups. Some potential causes include differences in sample data, lack of diversity in sample data, inadequate data normalization, process control, and missing samples and incorrect data labeled detected by the algorithm. And then one of the main consequences is for underrepresented demographics in the ICU, some of the resources could be deployed incorrectly. And as you can imagine, in the intensive care unit, time is of essence. So if this is being resources are being allocated incorrectly, this could be a matter of life and death. And someone who is actually in need of the care might not get it due to some of the inherent biases in the software. And specific example is a Framingham Heart study where there's a disparity between historical data available for Caucasian patients in comparison to that of other underrepresented communities. And then the skews and compromises the quality of data and suggestions provided by the algorithm. But to give a little bit of background of the Framingham study, that was done in 1950, and Framingham, Massachusetts, and is essentially led by the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute and aimed to identify risk factors for heart disease and stroke following multiple generations of participants. And then this has kind of been kind of the gold standard. And there has been a lot of evidence that's proved that some of the frameworks behind this specific study lead to lower risk of heart disease and also leads to better prevention and treatment as well. But one of the main concerns with the study is less than 4% of the study cohort is of non European original descent. So, what this means is that there's a lot of underrepresented demographics data, and it hasn't really accounted for those within the algorithm. And then, and then there's one study, and I'm going to talk about it here. So, there was, yeah, I think this is the study. So, this was done in 2024, 2025, where it detects the risk for coronary heart disease, and it was based on a neural network. And then it used the original framework for the Framingham Heart Study, and then specifically the 42,000 or 540 data instances and 15 risk factors. But the problem with this is, first, this is data from the 1950s, so different technologies has emerged, and also the fact that it hasn't really accounted for the demographic changes as well. But that's one of the main concerns with still implementing something that's historical and hasn't been updated. Though this has been a proven method, it hasn't really accounted for a lot of the changes that has occurred in the future. So that's one of the areas where there's data biases in terms of not being able to update historical data to train new data. But also another challenge is sometimes the inherent biases that are in the algorithm, specifically algorithm processing biases, allow for the AI system to be trained to be able to deal and mitigate future biases and certain type of biases. So there are certain biases that are used to be able to mitigate future biases, and those are just going to be inherent there. And there's not a whole lot that could actually be done to fix those or mitigate those specific biases because they serve an actual function within the algorithm of the surgical robot or any type of data to provide advice or suggestions on how to treat a certain type of disease or treatment for a certain type of illness. Next slide. Okay, so summary of literature, summary Q2, and identifying of ethical concern and concerns. So it is evident there's a lack of sampling data that exists for different demographics and people across the world. And then there's inherent biases on the algorithmic software based on data availability and accuracy of the data, being contingent upon data available for these groups. And then some algorithmic biases can be based on historical studies and might account and normalize for different test scenarios, such as the Framingham Heart Study that I just described. And then I underlined this specific aspect, but the key concept that I'm going to address in my formulation is the ethical concern identified in the slide is there's a lack of equal benefits and access to accurate information pertaining to AI, given the biases in different demographic data and the biases that already exist in the software. And the application section for Q2 will discuss a unique formulation based on some of the theories to address some of the ethical concerns. So I'll get started on that. So it's going to load. All right. So application of Q2. So this is going to encompass of multiple theory applications. So to increase data sets from certain underrepresented communities, this will require some collaboration between different countries where there's a lack of resources. In the course of this encounter, collaboration with key leaders, government employees, health regulation agencies, and formal boards are needed to be implemented in areas because there are certain laws such as patient rights, autonomy, certain type of regulations with what type of treatment might be available, might not be available. There's a lot of stakeholders that need to be talked to before a lot of these things can really be implemented. So that's where the collaboration aspect comes into play. So another aspect is they can work with other key surgical robot countries in the world that are innovators in surgical robots, such as Germany, South Korea, Canada, Italy, and also countries that are just interested in surgical robots. And by providing these resources to underrepresented communities, depending on scope and resources being available, And by working with these countries from a utilitarianism standpoint, sharing info within the course of discovery on how uh, to address for some of these uh, lack of data, this can allow for the countries to learn between the different softwares and trying to see how to fix their own individual algorithmic biases. And then incentive the U.S. government can do to increase access and education of surgical robots while also providing objective data, good or bad, to allow patients to either be a participant in the study or not. So transparency about a relatively new concept of surgical procedure needs to be disclosed to patients before implementing the procedure, and this increased the autonomy of patients. And this ties to also, the deontology aspect. From a deontological perspective, even if country laws do not require any form of liability insurance, participants that are part of the study also covered in situation of wrongful death and complications, and measures are put in place to ensure the status of patients abroad are based on a moral duty. And then this ties towards the concept of Asimov's first law of not harming another human being. And then I will want to address one point. Given the fact that there is an interest to being able to get data from underrepresented communities in order for the sake of improving the algorithmic biases that exist within the surgical robot software, one can really argue that uh, the fact that there is a vested interest or an interest that serves as an end, serves as a means to an end, which would violate deontological perspective based on Kant. But at the same time, the morality of providing care to underrepresented communities and directly addressing the inadequacies in underrepresented communities has moral worth in and of itself from a deontological perspective, which in turn will positively impact aspects of utilitarianism. And also, that's one aspect where by ensuring the autonomy of the patients from the underrepresented communities, transparencies, and sharing the benefits of the end goal, the concept of deontology still applies in this situation. And then from a utilitarianism standpoint, study and increase research in other countries and demographic increase the overall quality of the algorithm, identifying other forms of disease and anomaly within the core study, and increase knowledge and education about surgical robots in these countries, which in turn leads to more information circulation and possibility of patients to trust the use of surgical robots to the better goal of improving surgical robot data biases. And then Q3 is going to be how are patients currently being informed about information data with respect to surgical robots and what type of challenges currently exist regarding surgical info that can be provided to patients. And next slide. So this is one of the reviews I went through, and by failing to state the risk, so this article explicitly mentioned just by merely failing to state the risk and being fully transparent with all risks associated with the surgical robot, in addition to overall effectiveness and procedure for marketing purposes, is unethical and compromise informed consent. Though approved by FDA and still approved, Intuitive Surgical has made claims about the effectiveness of the robot that has not been cleared by the FDA. So they've made uh, I guess I'll give some background behind Intuitive Surgical. They're the same company that made the Da Vinci robot, and I think, if I recall correctly, in the year 2000, they had uh, they advertised that they're able to do certain type of procedures. Some of the main procedures that they're most common for are going to be prostate, gynecologic cancer, uh, and then prostatectomy. There's That's where most of the specialization is, but and they were used in 2,500 devices and installed in more than 1,900 hospitals. And there's almost just 200,000 surgeries alone in 2012. So there is a lot of data. And out of all the equipment, this is the only one that's FDA approved and still FDA approved despite a lot of the ethical concerns, a lot of the injuries, and a lot of malfunctioning within the software. There's also situations where there's electric current that has actually caused some deaths, and some patients have been harmed by engineering defects for the Da Vinci robot itself, but it's still approved nonetheless. And as evidenced by the 10,000 Robodoc system operations currently in Germany from 1994 to 2004 for hip and knee arthroplasty, Corexo Technology, the manufacturer of Robodoc, provided insufficient info to the public, and it was discovered the procedure led to worse outcomes compared to the procedure conducted by the doctor, such as procedure time and blood loss. And then, in general, another area aside from these two specific cases is it threatens the concept of informed consent of the patient, including the potential misconception that a new procedure has increased inherent benefits, unavailability and inaccessibility of data, supporting material and evidence that elaborates on the risk and benefits of a new surgery, and the lack of education or lack of knowledge around the world the specific procedure exists through surgical robots. So the top image is a Da Vinci robot over here. This is kind of guided. The patient or the surgeon is able to move the arms. So there's specific buttons, certain type of levers as well that move the grippers. So it could deal with needling, suturing, a lot of the handheld aspects. And that one you can see there's a lot more needles as well. This is more for like an open heart or somewhere where a patient's going to be literally on the bed, the operating bed, and there's a lot more utensils that are involved in this. And as you can see, that specific surgeon is dealing and pressing certain type of buttons to enable some of those utensils to be deployed. And then the bottom one is a Robodoc machine that I just discussed over here. And then next slide. And then the other lit review is based on the ethical landscape of robotic assisted surgery, a systematic review, and then empirical data gathered by Lachar and AI found patients find it important to know if a surgeon performed this procedure for the very first time. Geiger and Herschel suggest, based on empirical evidence, that complications and malfunctions arise from the use of surgical robots and procedures frequently underreported. And then many of the ethical concerns concerning disclosure of data to patients include the difference in surgical learning curves through case exposure and gradual increase in case volume and difficulty. This in turn leads to subjectivity in terms of what info is deemed essential to inform patients. And then regardless of the credential aspect, each stage of the training creates a much higher risk in comparison to that of later stages and will incorporate different quality standards. So this kind of ties towards one of the concepts I mentioned earlier, where in the beginning there's expectation that there's going to be less quality standards given that this is a relatively new field and the person is getting experience, but as they progress, the standards are going to be much more stricter. But there's, at the same time, there's also subjectivity matter in terms of when it's essential to inform the patients given those observations. And then according to Sullins, given that surgery has probability of having limited experience in performing procedures with surgical robots, this creates another situation where the surgeon themselves might not have all the info to actually advise of patients what the best course of action is, just because they're not adequately prepared in dealing with surgical robots to say one way or the other in terms of whether opting out of surgical robots would be the best course of action or whether they should actually proceed with going with surgical robots. And then summary of literature review and ethical issue identified. So similar to the last one, I'm going to identify and underline what the ethical concern that I'm going to address in the formulation. So all the lit review findings provide evidence that there's deceptive practices. So the specific one I described was intuitive surgical for the Da Vinci robots and then Robodoc in Germany regarding underreporting on complications that arise from surgical robots. And then there's a pattern of lack of knowledge of many people, including both the manufacturer and the surgeon, to conduct procedures using surgical robots. This in turn affects the ability of both parties to provide accurate and credible info to patients, given there's a vested interest in profits and conflict of interest. And the main ethical concern derived from the findings of lack of transparency that appears in the presentation of data to patients due to a combination of conflict of interest between stakeholders, like I just mentioned. And then on the next slides, I'm going to discuss a unique formulation. So application of theories, ethical question 3. Next slide. All right. So application of theories for Q3. There's going to be multiple theories that are involved in this, similar to Q2. And then for this specific formulation, what I believe would be the best course of action is having a separate entity that's completely independent of the hospital doing all the record keeping Typically, there's always within hospitals, there's record keeping departments. There's a long time ago, they had manual sheets to monitor data, keep track of data. But the specific role of this department, and they're going to be completely operated by the state and government level. And that's how essentially taxpayer dollars are going to be paying for this specific agency. So this reduces and takes away any of the form of conflict of interest. So if they're not employees of hospitals and manufacturers, they're not necessarily going to have a vested interest to uh, over exaggerate or mislead any type of data that might actually exist. So their job is going to be essentially to record keep the data as it is, whether the data is good, whether how many actual testing has occurred within that specific institution. Given the complexity of this, the state level would be the best course action. This agency, and obviously there's going to be employees that will be deployed to different type of counties. At least in Michigan, there's Oakland County, I'm giving examples, but it's going to be applied all across the country where it's at the state level, but there's going to be processes in place within hospitals where people will be able to access data within the hospitals to see how many surgical robot surgeries were done, what the experience level with those specific doctors are with respect to surgical robots, how much experience they had, or certain information under HIPAA would not be able to be provided, such as identity of patients, but certain type of info such as the age of patients, ethnicity, complications of surgery, difficulty level of procedure, certain metrics, and also complications and other post-surgery uh, symptoms. That type of stuff can certainly be accessible to the public, and the type of information would be obviously redacted based on what is actually being looked for. But long story short, this agency is going to be keeping track of all the data that's coming in and reporting data as it is. And then from a utilitarianism standpoint, the benefit of the maximum number of patients in state to ensure that the patient fully understand all aspects before deciding to opt in for a surgical procedure. So this also kind of ties towards a concept of autonomy, where patients should have the free and moral will to decide whether they want to use surgical robots or whether they want the procedure to be done through human operation. And then from a deontological standpoint, it's morally right to provide all unbiased, neutral statistic info with respect to surgical robots, regardless of how unpromising or how undesirable the info might be. Potential lack of experience of surgeon, how info that might cause skepticism by the public to pursue medical treatment. And then the goal of implementing this process is for the patients that make the final say at the end of the day and have the full autonomy before deciding on the procedure to be conducted through surgical robots. This ties towards one of the key principles in deontology, which is autonomy again. So this is the end of my presentation, and this is going to be all the references that are outlined. And thank you again for spending the time watching through my very long presentation, and really appreciate the time that you spent to listen to my presentation. Thank you.